In 1963, the upstairs of this building was the Carousel Club, a burlesque house operated by Jack Ruby. A Dallas Utility Company employee, who was then a part-time cab driver, said that during this period, he once picked up Lee Harvey Oswald and an unidentified older man and brought them to the club.
During that period, I picked up a man in my cab who I later found to be Lee Harvey Oswald. We talked at length on the way to the address he had given me. Several months later, and to the best of my memory, in early 1963, I was driving my taxi and was stopped by three men. I recognized one of the men as being Lee Harvey Oswald, and we spoke about our previous meeting. At their request, I took the three men to the Carousel Club on Commerce Street in Dallas, Texas, and they left my cab.
That's a Dallas taxi driver named Raymond Cummings. He's talking there in 1967, and he's claiming that in early 1963, before the assassination of President Kennedy, he picked up Lee Harvey Oswald in his cab on two separate occasions, and on one of those occasions dropped Oswald off at the Carousel Club, which was of course the Dallas strip club owned by Jack Ruby, who ended up murdering Oswald 2 days after the assassination. Raymond Cummings' story had no basis in fact at all, and shortly after Cummings went public, he promptly re-vanished into obscurity. The best you can say for Raymond Cummings is that he was honestly mistaken about the identity of the man he picked up in his cab, but it seems more likely that he was just lying, and that he made his story up to give himself a walk-on part in this great American drama. A lot of people did that after the Kennedy assassination. For a while, stories like Raymond Cummings's were a dime a dozen. All over Dallas and New Orleans, obscure citizens came out of the woodwork to claim that they'd had some kind of encounter or brush with Oswald in the days or months before Kennedy's death. And these people always turned out to have seen Oswald doing something significant or suspicious. They always claimed to have seen him chumming around with other key assassination figures like Jack Ruby or J.D. Tippit, or sometimes even with both of them at once. In fact, there were so many of these bogus Oswald sightings that they gave rise to their own special branch of conspiracy theory, which was known as the Second Oswald theory. According to the Second Oswald theory, an imposter had gone around systematically pretending to be Lee Harvey Oswald in the weeks before the assassination. This imposter kept turning up in places where the real Oswald couldn't physically have been, and he kept drawing attention to himself by doing eye-catching things like taking a car for a test drive at top speed, or showing up at a rifle range and firing bullets into other people's targets, or making a spectacle of himself in Mexico City at the same time the real Oswald was there. In 1966, a whole book based on this theory came out. It was called The Second Oswald, and its author was a tenured professor of philosophy named Richard Popkin. Popkin's book assumed that all these people who claimed to have encountered Oswald before the assassination were telling the truth, except that the man they'd encountered wasn't the real Oswald. He was an imposter, and he was part of an insanely elaborate plot to set Oswald up for Kennedy's murder in advance of the crime. Even though Popkin was a professor of philosophy, he apparently had never heard of Occam's razor, which tells us that the simplest explanation is usually the best. The simplest explanation of nearly all these supposed sightings of Oswald before the assassination is that they didn't really happen. The people telling these stories were either honestly mistaken or they were making stuff up to get attention. Or maybe they'd seen someone who looked a bit like Oswald and they'd managed to convince themselves that it really was him. But there is one unofficial sighting of Oswald before the assassination that can't be dismissed that easily. Most unofficial Oswald sightings fall to pieces when you start to examine them, but when you examine this one, it just keeps looking stronger. It's an Oswald sighting that has stood the test of time and has never conclusively been disproved. Even today, 60 years after the assassination, it stubbornly refuses to go away.
The taller man introduced the other two men. Leopoldo, he said that was his name. He introduced the American who was in the middle as Leon Oswald, and he introduced the one that seemed Mexican and spoke with a Mexican accent as Angelo.
That's a Cuban-American woman named Sylvia Odio speaking in 1993. At the time of Kennedy's murder, Sylvia Odio was 26 years old, and she was living in Dallas. She was part of a large Cuban family that had relocated to the United States after Castro's revolution. Both of her parents were still sitting in a Cuban prison where they'd been locked up as opponents of Castro's regime, and Sylvia Odio herself was actively involved in the anti-Castro underground in America. After Kennedy was murdered, Sylvia Odio told several of her close friends that she'd had a troubling encounter about 2 months before the assassination with a man she was sure was Oswald. Sylvia Odio's story was strange, but it was also very detailed and compelling. She never changed it, and she never retracted it. When she was questioned by the Warren Commission and later on by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, both those bodies concluded that Sylvia Odio wasn't lying. In other words, they both tended to believe that she did have an encounter before the assassination with a man she sincerely believed to be Oswald. But whether that man really was Oswald was another question. And as we're going to see, it's the central question we need to answer if we're going to arrive at a true understanding of what the Odio incident meant. Anyway, here is the story that Sylvia Odio told. One night in September 1963, 3 men appeared on the doorstep of her apartment in Dallas and rang the doorbell. It was the middle of the evening, around 9 p.m. Sylvia's younger sister Annie answered the door.
One night I opened the door for 3 men that came to see one of my sisters. I opened the door. They were in a small hallway with bright lights overhead.
That's Annie Odio speaking there. In September 1963, Annie Odio was 17 years old, and she was visiting Sylvia's apartment that night to help out with her 4 young children. Annie Odio spoke to the 3 men on the doorstep only briefly. They told her that they were there to see Sylvia, and so Annie went off to get her, although she was careful to leave the chain on the door. The Odio sisters were always wary of strange visitors. Cuban exile politics could be dangerous, and people weren't always who they claimed to be. When Sylvia Odio came to the door, she didn't recognize any of the 3 men outside. 2 of them were Cubans, or at least they claimed to be. Sylvia had an impression that they looked more like Mexicans. The 3rd man on her doorstep was an American. When Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested after Kennedy's murder, Sylvia Odio instantly recognized him as the man she'd seen at her apartment that night. So did Annie Odio, who'd got a good look at the man when she answered the door. Sylvia got a bad vibe from the 3 men. She never let them into the apartment. Her whole conversation with them took place with them out on the front step, standing under the porch light. The American said almost nothing during that conversation. Most of the talking was done in Spanish by the taller of the 2 Cuban men, who called himself Leopoldo. Leopoldo explained that he was a member of the anti-Castro underground, and he was a friend of Sylvia's father. Leopoldo was not his real name. People in the Cuban underground always used so-called war names to protect their true identities. Leopoldo was the tall man's war name, and the war name of the shorter Latin man was Angelo. Leopoldo and Angelo seemed to know a lot of information about Sylvia's father. They knew what his underground code name was, for example. Leopoldo explained that he and the other 2 men had just come from New Orleans, where they'd been trying to get a local anti-Castro movement off the ground. He'd brought along a document written in Spanish. It was some kind of petition or fundraising letter, and he wanted Sylvia's help to translate it into English. He also seemed keen to introduce her to the American. "We wanted you to meet this American," Leopoldo said. "His name is Leon Oswald." He repeated that twice, Sylvia said later.
The American was introduced as Leon Oswald. That would always be in my mind very clearly.
Leopoldo told Sylvia that Leon Oswald was very much interested in the anti-Castro cause. Leon Oswald himself didn't have much to say because he didn't seem to understand or speak Spanish. He mainly just stood there with a little smile on his face, Sylvia remembered later on. But at one point he did try to be cute, as Sylvia put it, by saying a few basic words in Spanish like hola. To be polite to him, Sylvia asked Leon Oswald a few questions in English. She asked him if he'd ever been to Cuba, and he said that he hadn't. "Are you interested in our movement?" she said, and he said yes. Sylvia was in a bit of a hurry because she was about to go out on a date, so she told the three men that she didn't have any more time to talk and that she couldn't offer them any help until she'd written to her father in Cuba first and confirmed that they really were friends of his. So the three men went on their way. They headed off in a car with Leopoldo at the wheel. But the really interesting part of Sylvia Odio's story happened the next day when she received a phone call from one of the men.
It was from Leopoldo, which was the tall guy.
Leopoldo's motive for ringing Sylvia wasn't purely political. Sylvia Odio was an attractive woman, and Leopoldo was trying to get fresh with me, as Sylvia put it later. He started off by telling her he thought she was pretty. When that got him nowhere, Leopoldo started talking to Sylvia about the American, Leon Oswald.
And he told me the first thing he said was, "What do you think of the American?" And I said, "Well, I didn't think very much. I didn't make an opinion."
Leopoldo explained that he was currently in two minds about Oswald. He was thinking about introducing him into the anti-Castro underground, but he was worried that he somehow didn't seem completely sincere. Also, this Oswald character seemed to have a fairly crude view of Cuban politics. He seemed to believe that all Cubans hated all Americans, for example. More to the point, Leopoldo was worried that Oswald seemed to be, quote, kind of loco.
He says, "Well, he's kind of loco. Loco means crazy in Spanish, and he's kind of nuts. And he's a Marine, an ex-Marine. He's an expert marksman, and he would be a tremendous asset to anyone, except that he said, you never know how to take him. He can go either way." So I didn't know if he was trying to sell him to me or he was trying to get an opinion from me.
So exactly what made Leopoldo worry that Oswald might be a bit loco? Well, Oswald had said something quite shocking to Leopoldo about President Kennedy. He said that President Kennedy should be assassinated. He said that the Cubans should have had the courage to shoot Kennedy in revenge for the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs fiasco had happened in April 1961, just a few months after Kennedy took office. A bunch of anti-Castro Cuban exiles who had been trained and sponsored by the CIA landed in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs with a plan to invade the country and topple Castro. Kennedy had approved of that operation to start with, and he had agreed to provide American air support. But when the invasion started to go pear-shaped, Kennedy withdrew the air support, and the anti-Castro rebels were routed. According to what Leopoldo told Sylvia Odio over the phone, Oswald said that Kennedy, quote, ought to have been assassinated for his role in the Bay of Pigs disaster. "You Cubans don't have any guts," Oswald had said.
So this guy, Leopoldo, insisted that the American had said that we Cubans
should have shot President Kennedy after Bay of Pigs, that we didn't have any guts, and that we should do something like that.
So that was Sylvia Odio's story. Unlike so many other alleged encounters with Oswald, the encounter described by Sylvia Odio was elaborate and weirdly detailed. And if her story was true, it was dynamite. It meant that Oswald, or a man who called himself Oswald and looked exactly like him, was chumming around with a couple of mysterious Cuban men just 2 months before the assassination. And he'd told those men that somebody ought to shoot President Kennedy. Some conspiracy theorists have said that the Odio incident is the proof of the plot. That's going too far, since it's never been entirely clear that the Odio incident really happened, let alone that it proves anything specific. The writer Anthony Summers, though, has a much better phrase for the Odio incident. He has called it the strongest human evidence of conspiracy. And that claim is hard to argue with. Even if you don't think there was a conspiracy, the Odio incident is a truly spooky piece of evidence, and it can't be just swept under the carpet. Whether you believe in a Kennedy conspiracy or not, you can't claim to have arrived at a complete understanding of the assassination story until you've dealt with the challenge of the Odio incident. My name is David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. To get to grips with the Odio incident, we need to answer two basic questions about it. One, did it really happen? And two, if it did, what did it mean? The first question, did the incident really happen, isn't as simple as it sounds, because it's possible that some parts of Sylvia Odio's story were true and other parts were not. So really we need to break down that first question, did the Odio incident happen? We need to break that question down into a series of smaller questions. Like, for starters, was it at least true that 3 strange men came to Sylvia Odio's door one night in September of 1963? If that was true, was it also true that one of those men was introduced to her as Leon Oswald? If he was he the real Oswald, or was he someone pretending to be Oswald? And if he was the real Oswald, then what was he doing hanging around with a couple of anti-Castro activists who were thinking of admitting him into the anti-Castro underground? As we know, the real Oswald was the opposite of an anti-Castro activist. Castro was Oswald's hero. In fact, at the time the Odio incident supposedly occurred in late September of 1963, Oswald was just a day or two away from trying to defect to Cuba. He was about to head down to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, and he planned to persuade the staff there to grant him a Cuban transit visa. And if that attempt succeeded, it seems that Oswald then hoped that he would be allowed to stay in Cuba for the rest of his life. So why would he have wanted to show up on the doorstep of a prominent anti-Castro activist a few days before that, while pretending to be a die-hard anti-Castro man himself? If Oswald did do that, you have to ask what the hell he was playing at. To work out how seriously we should take Sylvia Odio's story, we need to begin at the beginning and look at how her story came to light in the first place. One important thing to note about Sylvia Odio is that she wasn't a publicity seeker. I know of only 2 interviews that she's ever given on camera, one of them in 1978 and the other in 1983. In the first interview, she didn't even show her face. She appeared only as a silhouette. So the 1983 interview seems to be the one and only time that Sylvia Odio ever showed her face on TV. In fact, if Sylvia Odio had had a way, her story never would have come out in the first place. After the assassination, she didn't come forward to tell her story to the authorities. She told it only to a few close friends. But one of those friends then reported the story to the FBI, which pissed Sylvia off quite a bit. A few weeks after the assassination, a pair of FBI agents came to her work to visit Sylvia, and she reluctantly told them her story. And you can see why she would have been reluctant to tell that story if it was true. The Odio family were active members of the anti-Castro underground. Sylvia's parents were still locked up in a Cuban prison. They were still vulnerable to the whims of the Castro regime. If Sylvia Odio's story was true, if Lee Harvey Oswald was hanging around with two of her father's political allies shortly before the assassination, and if he told them that it would be a great idea to shoot Kennedy, well, that clearly seemed to implicate Sylvia Odio's own side of Cuban politics in the murder of the American president. So you can see why Sylvia Odio wouldn't have wanted anybody to know about this story if it was true. More to the point, you can see that she would have had no incentive at all to make such a story up. She would have had nothing to gain from doing that, and quite a lot to lose. One thing about Sylvia Odio's story that almost all reasonable commentators accept is that she didn't simply invent it. At a very minimum, it seems clear that she honestly believed her story to be true. That doesn't mean that it was true, of course, but already that puts her story a long way ahead of most of the other purported encounters that people had with Oswald before the assassination. Also, you have to remember that Annie Odio backed up her sister's story. She too said that three strange men had come to the apartment that night. Annie wasn't in earshot when Leopoldo introduced the American to Sylvia as Leon Oswald, but she did get a good look at him when she opened the door, and like Sylvia, Annie swore later on that the man she saw was Oswald. Nobody was ever able to shake Sylvia or Annie Odio on that point. Both sisters always maintained that the man they saw was Oswald. If the authorities wanted to shake their story, they were going to have to shake it from the other angle by establishing whether it was physically possible for Oswald to have been in Dallas when the Odio sisters said he was. To investigate that point, the authorities first had to work out exactly when the Odio sisters believed the incident had occurred. When the FBI interviewed Sylvia for the first time, just a month after the assassination, they asked her to try to put an exact date on the incident. She told them that she thought it had happened in late September or early October 1963, but she said that she couldn't be more specific than that. Unfortunately, the FBI wasn't hugely interested in following up on Sylvia Odio's story at that time, when it was still fresh in her mind, because as we've seen, J. Edgar Hoover didn't want there to have been any conspiracy behind Kennedy's murder. Hoover's big desire was to wrap up the case for a lone gunman as fast as he could. The Warren Commission was more scrupulous. It really was interested in seeing whether there was any conspiracy behind Kennedy's murder. It knew that if it was going to conduct a proper inquiry, all the conspiratorial possibilities would have to be thoroughly investigated. And Sylvia Odio's story was one of the most troubling pieces of conspiratorial evidence on the table. Sylvia Odio was called to testify before the Warren Commission in July 1964, and her testimony was taken by the attorney Wesley Liebler, who we've encountered several times before in this podcast. By the time Sylvia Odio spoke to Liebler, she'd come closer to pinpointing the exact date when the three men had come to her apartment. She'd realised that the incident couldn't have happened after October the 1st, 1963, because she'd moved into a different apartment in Dallas on that date. And she knew that the incident had to have occurred very shortly before October the 1st because she remembered that she was packing up her stuff at the time and the apartment was full of boxes. She was also quite confident that the incident had happened on a weeknight because she knew that she'd been to work on the day the men came. Her best guess was that it had happened on either Thursday, September the 26th, or Friday, September the 27th, 1963. Sylvia Odio brought along a crucial piece of documentary evidence on the day she testified to the Warren Commission. She handed this document to Wesley Liebler and she told him that she wanted the commission to keep it. It was a letter that her father had sent to her from his prison cell in Cuba, and it was dated December the 25th, 1963. At one point in this letter, her father addressed himself to an earlier letter that Sylvia had written to him. She'd written that letter just a few days after being visited by the three strange men. She'd described that encounter in her letter, and she'd asked her father if he had any friends who went by the war names of Leopoldo and Angelo. And her father had replied in his letter of December the 25th, "No, I don't know any men who use those names, and you should beware of these people who call themselves my friends." This letter from Sylvia Odio's father offered some strong, independent proof that Sylvia really had been visited by three strange men at the time she claimed. And later on, two more independent witnesses said that Sylvia had told them about this strange visit in real time before the Kennedy assassination occurred. One of these witnesses was a Catholic priest, and the other was Sylvia Odio's psychiatrist. The priest said that Sylvia told him about the incident in late September, just a day or two after she'd received the disturbing phone call from Leopoldo. The psychiatrist said more or less the same thing. He recalled that Sylvia had found the visit of the three men peculiar and troubling. He also recalled her saying that one of the men was an American, although he couldn't recall if she'd told him that the man's name was Leon Oswald. When you put all this evidence together, it becomes almost impossible to disbelieve Sylvia Odio's claim that she received a visit from three sinister anti-Castro militants in the last week of September 1963. When Wesley Liebler took Sylvia Odio's Warren Commission testimony, he found that part of it to be very credible. But he found it hard to believe that one of the three men was Oswald, because by this time the Warren Commission had developed evidence which seemed to suggest that Oswald couldn't have been in Dallas when Sylvia Odio said he was. In 1966, a couple of years after the Warren report was published, Wesley Liebler went on a talkback radio show to defend the report against the barrage of criticism that it was copying from the conspiracy theorists and from the general public. One of the talkback callers asked Liebler about the Odio incident, and here's what he said in reply.
I took, as you probably well know, I took Mrs. Odio's testimony and spent considerable time discussing this with her in Dallas. I don't think that Lee Oswald was there for many reasons. Basically, because it was almost impossible for him to have been there as a physical matter. He was in transit at that time from New Orleans to Mexico City and crossed the border. You're probably familiar with the time sequence.
Yes, I noticed a tight schedule there.
Very tight schedule. It was an almost impossible.
Couldn't they have driven from New Orleans as the men said they did, or as Mrs. Odio said they said?
Pardon?
Couldn't they have driven from New Orleans as Mrs. Odio said that they said they did?
They would have had to have moved very rapidly to do so.
As Liebler says there, Oswald's schedule was very tight in that last week of September 1963, when the Odio incident supposedly occurred. Notice, though, that Liebler didn't say that it was impossible for Oswald to have been at Odio's apartment during that week. He only said that it was almost impossible. The last week of September 1963 was the week when Oswald wrapped up the New Orleans phase of his life and set out for Mexico City, hoping to get the visa that would get him into Cuba. I told that story in detail back in episode 4 of this podcast, but let's briefly remind ourselves now of what was going on in Oswald's life at that time. On the weekend of September the 21st and 22nd, Marina's friend Ruth Payne drove to New Orleans in her station wagon. Marina was heavily pregnant with the Oswald's second child at this point. The plan was for her and their daughter June to head off to Dallas and live there with Ruth Paine. Marina would have the baby in Dallas, and meanwhile Oswald would go down to Mexico to try his luck at the Cuban and Soviet embassies. Officially, Oswald told Marina that she and the children could then reunite with him later in Cuba, or at worst in Russia if his planned defection to Cuba didn't come off. But Marina had her doubts that this would ever happen. She suspected that Oswald was about to disappear into Cuba and she was never going to see him again. Marina and Ruth left New Orleans for Dallas on the morning of Monday, September the 23rd. Oswald himself left New Orleans either the next day or the day after that. As we're going to see, the question of exactly when and exactly how Oswald left New Orleans has never properly been resolved, and that uncertainty makes it very hard to rule out the possibility that he could have been at Sylvia Odio's apartment one night that week. We do know for sure that Oswald was still in New Orleans at some point on Tuesday the 24th, because he showed up at the unemployment office that day to sign a form. After that, the next reliable sighting of Oswald didn't come for another 48 hours. At around dawn on Thursday the 26th, Oswald was seen on a bus that had left Houston, Texas at 2:35 that morning and was now bound for the town of Laredo, down near the Mexican border. Oswald changed buses at Laredo, and later that Thursday morning he crossed the border into Mexico. Oswald's visit to Mexico City ended up being a huge disappointment. He got no joy from either the Cuban or the Soviet embassy, and he returned to America with his tail between his legs on Wednesday, October the 2nd. So what happens when we try to map the claims of Sylvia Odio onto the timeline of Oswald's known movements? For a start, we can see that Sylvia Odio must have misremembered the date of the incident, if the man she saw at her door was the real Oswald. She told the Warren Commission that her best guess was that the incident had happened on either Thursday the 26th or Friday the 27th. But the real Oswald was down in Mexico on both of those nights. The only nights that week when he could even conceivably have been at Sylvia Odio's apartment in Dallas were the nights of Tuesday the 24th and Wednesday the 25th. The Warren Commission believed that there was persuasive evidence that ruled out both of those nights. It believed that the Tuesday night was out because it believed that it had firm evidence that Oswald was still in New Orleans that night and for part of the next day. And it believed the Wednesday night was out because it believed that Oswald spent Wednesday night sitting on a bus bound from New Orleans to Houston. According to the Warren Commission's timeline, Oswald caught a Trailways bus that left New Orleans at 12:30 on Wednesday afternoon and got into Houston at 10:50 that night. The Commission believed that Oswald had then made a local telephone call in Houston when the bus arrived, which seemed to offer further proof that he was a long way from Dallas. Houston and Dallas are more than 200 miles apart. The drive between them takes at least 3.5 hours. Obviously, if Oswald placed a local phone call in Houston at around 11 p.m, he couldn't have been in Dallas at 9 p.m. After making that phone call, according to the Warren Commission, Oswald had then hung around in Houston until 2:35 the next morning when he'd boarded that bus bound for Laredo. So as far as the Warren Commission was concerned, the Odio incident couldn't have happened on either the Tuesday or the Wednesday night, which effectively meant that it couldn't have happened at all. That's why you read in the Warren report that, quote, "The Commission has concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was not at Mrs. Odio's apartment in September of 1963. As we're going to see, though, there were some major problems with the evidence the Warren Commission based this conclusion on. I think it should be clear by this point in the podcast that I'm not generally into knocking the Warren Commission. I think on the whole it did a first-rate investigation, especially when you consider the time constraints that it was operating under. But I don't think there's any question that the Warren Commission did badly dropped the ball on the Odio incident. Some of the worst howlers in the whole of the Warren Report come in the pages where the Commission tries to dispose of Sylvia Odio's story. In fact, before the Warren Report was published, the staff members there who knew the Odio evidence best tried to warn the Commission that it would be a mistake to dismiss Sylvia Odio's claims too lightly. They knew that the evidence surrounding Oswald's movements on the Tuesday and Wednesday of that week was in fact very sketchy, and it didn't really support the conclusions that the Commission wanted to base on it. Take the Commission's belief that Oswald took the 12:30 bus from New Orleans on Wednesday, which got into Houston at 10:50 that night. This belief was really nothing more than an assumption. The Commission had no evidence that Oswald had bought a ticket for that bus, and it couldn't find any witnesses who recalled seeing him on it. That was a bit odd because the Commission was able to find witnesses who had seen Oswald on every other leg of his bus journey to Mexico and from Mexico back to Dallas. And yet the Commission could find no other passenger who recalled seeing Oswald on that bus from New Orleans to Houston, despite the fact that the journey had lasted for 10 hours, and at one point the bus had only had 11 passengers on it. And both the drivers who had driven the bus that day couldn't recall seeing Oswald on it either. The guy who drove the first leg of the journey, which lasted 8 hours, told the FBI that he, quote, does not recall ever seeing Oswald in person at any time. Several very good writers about the Kennedy case have pointed out that the fact that the Commission looked so hard for evidence that Oswald was on that bus and never ended up finding any does give us evidence of a kind that he wasn't on that bus. At the very least, it's fair to say that the question of how Oswald got from New Orleans to Houston was never properly answered. Strictly speaking, there's a black hole in Oswald's schedule that stretches from at least the middle of Wednesday until around 6 on the Thursday morning, when he was seen on the bus from Houston to Laredo. The Warren Commission's idea that Oswald got from New Orleans to Houston by bus was really just a guess based on the fact that he must have got from New Orleans to Houston somehow. But if he didn't get there on that bus, that does seem to open up a hypothetical window in which the Odio incident could have occurred precisely as Sylvia Odio said it did. Oswald could have travelled from New Orleans to Dallas by car on the Wednesday afternoon in the company of the two men Sylvia Odio said she saw him with. The drive from New Orleans to Dallas takes about 8 hours, so if Oswald and the two men left New Orleans at around lunchtime, they could have been at Sylvia Odio's apartment when she said they were, at 9 p.m. And after leaving her apartment, the men could then have driven Oswald from Dallas to Houston, which takes around 3.5 hours. Oswald could even have got a bus from Dallas to Houston. Either way, he would have been comfortably in Houston by 2:35 a.m. so that he could catch the bus bound for Laredo that he was seen on shortly after dawn on Thursday morning. The only piece of evidence that gets in the way of this Wednesday night scenario is the local phone call that Oswald supposedly placed in Houston that night. That is quite a tricky piece of evidence, and I'll be coming back to it later. At this point, though, you may be thinking that if there is other evidence that seems to get in the way of Sylvia Odio's story, why don't we just accept that evidence and conclude that her story must be wrong? A lot of reliable commentators have reached that conclusion. And as we know, eyewitness testimony can very often be wrong. In fact, that's one of the great general lessons of this case. If an eyewitness claim isn't backed up by other evidence, it's generally pretty rash to believe that the eyewitness is right. A good 90% of the conspiracy theories about this case are based on the mistake of believing eyewitnesses when their testimony doesn't fit in with the harder evidence. So why should we believe Sylvia Odio's story if there is other seemingly quite credible evidence that suggests that she just couldn't have been right? I partly answered that question before when I said that Sylvia Odio's story isn't just any old eyewitness story. It's chillingly believable, and there's no apparent reason why she would have wanted to make it up. In fact, I might as well put my cards on the table now and say that I think the Odio incident did occur. I think it happened exactly the way Sylvia Odio said it did, right down to the fact that the man at her door was the real Lee Harvey Oswald. I think there are many good reasons to believe this. I've mentioned a few of those reasons already, and I'll be mentioning more of them as we go along. I don't think the incident necessarily happened on the Wednesday night. I think the Tuesday night is a possibility too. And I don't think the incident necessarily suggests that Oswald was part of any conspiracy. We know that Oswald had a track record of trying to infiltrate anti-Castro groups for his own political purposes, and it's quite possible that this is what he was up to again when he showed up at Sylvia's apartment with the two anti-Castro Cubans. If Oswald was up to his old infiltration tricks, that would explain why Leopoldo felt that he wasn't sincere and possibly couldn't be trusted. There are many little details like that in Sylvia Odio's story that fit in uncannily well with our known picture of Oswald. And the more of these little details you notice, the harder it becomes to believe that the man at Sylvia Odio's door wasn't Oswald. Here's another one of those little details. Leopoldo told Sylvia Odio that he and his two friends had just come from New Orleans and were about to head off on a trip somewhere. That was why they'd turned up at her apartment at such a late hour. Leopoldo didn't say where it was they were about to head off to, but Sylvia somehow got the feeling that they were headed for either Miami or Puerto Rico. When you hear Sylvia Odio mention little details like these, you have to ask yourself a question. What were the odds that during the very week when Oswald did travel from New Orleans to Texas, on the eve of his big trip to Mexico, Sylvia Odio would claim to have been visited in Texas by a man she swore was Oswald, who had just come from New Orleans and was about to leave on a big trip to some unspecified destination? When you think about the Odio incident from that angle, the fact that Oswald had a tight schedule that week doesn't make Sylvia Odio's story seem less credible. It makes it seem more credible. The reason why Oswald had a tight schedule is precisely because he was travelling from New Orleans to Mexico via Texas. If Sylvia Odio had said that Oswald's visit had happened just a week earlier, you could confidently say that her claim was false because Oswald was still in New Orleans with Marina at that time. And if Odio had claimed that the incident happened just 3 or 4 days later, you could confidently say that Oswald was down in Mexico. Instead, her story happened to hit this very brief sweet spot in Oswald's life when it wasn't strictly impossible that he could have been in Dallas at 9 o'clock one night, because he was off the grid at the time, and his movements have never strictly been accounted for. What were the odds that Sylvia Odio hit this sweet spot by accident? I think it's off the charts unlikely that she could have. And I find it much easier to believe that the reason she got all these spooky little details right is that she did encounter the real Oswald. If you wanted to be cynical, you could say that she invented the detail about the men coming from New Orleans because she'd somehow discovered that Oswald did leave New Orleans at around that time. Maybe she read that detail in a newspaper and added it to her story to make it sound more convincing. The same thing goes for the detail about Leon Oswald being an ex-Marine and an expert marksman. Maybe Sylvia also added that detail to her story once she found out that the real Oswald was an ex-Marine and an expert marksman. In fact, when you think about all these conspicuously accurate details in Sylvia Odio's story, you realise that the whole incident can only be explained in one of 3 basic ways. Either the man at Sylvia Odio's door was the real Oswald, or he was a man who was very elaborately pretending to be Oswald, or else Sylvia Odio simply made the whole story up and threw these accurate details in to make people think that she had encountered the real Oswald. But as I've said already, Sylvia Odio never wanted her story to get out in the first place, and she had no apparent motive for wanting people to believe that she'd encountered Oswald, given that the encounter seemed to implicate her own side of Cuban politics in the murder of the American president. Whichever way you slice it, Sylvia Odio's story presents us with a major logical headache. There's a lot of very impressive evidence which suggests that the Odio incident must have happened, but there's also a lot of very impressive evidence that suggests it can't have happened. To this day, nobody has really managed to explain the incident in a way that sits comfortably with all the available evidence. You get the nagging feeling that there are still some things about the incident we don't know. There are some missing pieces of the puzzle somewhere that would explain the incident satisfactorily, but those missing pieces have never been found and probably never will be. To back me up on this point, it's worth noting that behind the scenes at the Warren Commission, some of the sharpest minds on the legal staff also believed that the riddle of Sylvia Odio's testimony was never properly solved. You wouldn't know this from the text of the Warren report, which dismisses the Odio story fairly briskly, but right up until the moment the report went to press, some of the Commission's attorneys continued to lobby for further investigation of the Odio incident. On the day the final draft of the report was sent out to the 7 commissioners for comment, Wesley Liebler wrote a memo arguing that the report would be incomplete if it didn't offer some more coherent explanation of the Odio incident. The Commission's chief counsel, J. Lee Rankin, was ticked off at Liebler for making this 11th hour request. At this stage, we're supposed to be closing doors, not opening them, Rankin said. But just a week earlier, Rankin himself had written a letter to J. Edgar Hoover that said, quote, "It is a matter of some importance to the Commission that Mrs. Odio's allegations either be proved or disproved. Would you please conduct the investigation necessary to determine who it was that Mrs. Odio saw in or about late September or early October of 1963. This letter to J. Edgar Hoover seemed to work wonders. 2 weeks later, and just 3 days before the Warren report was submitted to President Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover gave the Warren Commission the closure that it was asking for. He told them that the FBI had finally solved the mystery of the Odio incident. The Bureau had located a Cuban-American man named Loren Hall, who claimed that he was one of the 3 men who had visited Sylvia Odio that night in September. Hall identified the other 2 men who were with him that night as a Mexican-American by the name of Lawrence Howard and an Anglo-American named William Seymour, who did happen to bear a superficial resemblance to Lee Harvey Oswald. J. Edgar Hoover wrote a letter to the Warren Commission that reported all the details of Loren Hall's story. Hoover even suggested that Sylvia Odio may have misheard or misremembered the name Loren Hall as Leon Oswald. Hoover's letter arrived at the offices of the Commission just in time to let the authors of the Warren report make a last-minute revision to the text. On page 324, they inserted a paragraph which named Hall, Howard and Seymour as the 3 men who Sylvia Odio had almost certainly seen at her apartment. The paragraph ended, quote, "While the FBI had not yet completed its investigation into this matter at the time the report went to press, the Commission has concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was not at Mrs. Odio's apartment in September of 1963. Unfortunately, there was one small problem with Loren Hall's story, which was that it was complete bullshit. Worse still, J. Edgar Hoover knew the story was complete bullshit when he passed it on to the Warren Commission. 2 days after Loren Hall told his story to the FBI, the Bureau tracked down the two men who he claimed to have gone to Odio's apartment with, William Seymour and Lawrence Howard. Both of them said that Hall's story wasn't true. What's more, William Seymour was able to produce proof that he'd been working in Florida at the time. And when Sylvia Odio was shown pictures of these three men, she said that they were not the same men who had come to her apartment. The FBI re-interviewed Lauren Hall after Seymour and Howard had denied his story, and Hall then admitted to the FBI that he'd made his story up. In fact, when Hall testified to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, he denied that he'd ever told the FBI such a story at all. He said that the FBI itself had made the story up to get the Warren Commission off its back. That claim isn't as far-fetched as it sounds, because we now know that when J. Edgar Hoover wrote to the Warren Commission to tell it that Hall, Seymour and Howard were the three men who had visited Odio's apartment, Hoover already knew that Seymour and Howard had denied Hall's story and that Hall himself had retracted it. We've seen before that J. Edgar Hoover had a terrible habit in the Kennedy case of pretending that things had been wrapped up when they really hadn't been, and it seems that he used this shameful tactic yet again in the case of the Odio incident. If Hoover hadn't told this lie to the Commission at the very last minute, just 3 days before it was due to present its report to President Johnson, then the Warren report wouldn't have wrongly assured Johnson and the American public that the Odio mystery had been solved. Almost certainly the Commission would have admitted that the evidence was still unclear. In fact, until a very late stage of proceedings, Wesley Liebler kept urging the Commission not to dismiss the Odio incident too lightly. The week before Hoover falsely told the Commission that the Odio problem had been fixed and that there was no need to worry about it anymore, Liebler wrote another one of his famous memos. Liebler had read the report's draft and he was worried about a sentence in it that said that there was, quote, persuasive evidence that Oswald never went to Sylvia Odio's apartment. Liebler argued that this language was too strong. He wrote, quote, Odio may well be right. The Commission will look bad if it turns out that she is. There is no need to look foolish by grasping at straws to avoid admitting that there is a problem. Years later, in 1977, Wesley Liebler appeared as a witness before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The committee's counsel said to him, "The Odio incident was never resolved to your satisfaction, was it?" And Liebler replied, "No, not really." It's nearly 50 years since Liebler said that, and the Odio incident is no more resolved now than it was then. It remains one of the case's great legitimate mysteries. No consensus has ever really been reached about it on either side of the assassination debate. Conspiracy theorists like to believe that the Odio incident occurred, and they like to talk about it, but they can't really agree about what it means. They can't even agree about whether the American man on Odio's doorstep was the real Oswald or someone pretending to be Oswald. Some of them think it was the real Oswald, but the majority of conspiracy theorists prefer to think that the man was an imposter, because, as we've seen, most conspiracy thinkers in this case prefer to believe that Oswald was completely innocent and that he was the victim of an almost inconceivably elaborate setup. And if an imposter was running around pretending to be Oswald 2 months before the assassination and was saying that Kennedy ought to be shot, that would be slam dunk proof that this elaborate frame-up really did occur. But what I find even more interesting about the Odio incident is that there's no consensus about it on the other side of the assassination debate either. That is, on the sane, non-conspiratorial side that accepts and respects the evidence that Oswald was guilty and almost certainly acted alone. Some of my favourite sensible writers about the assassination find it quite easy to dismiss Sylvia Odio's story because they think the evidence clearly shows that Oswald couldn't have been in Dallas on either the Tuesday night or the Wednesday night. But there are other sane and sensible commentators who feel that the Odio incident probably did happen. Vincent Bugliosi was probably the greatest ever foe of Kennedy conspiracy theory. In his book Reclaiming History, Bugliosi spent around 2,000 pages chasing down and squashing nearly every last Kennedy conspiracy theory under the sun, and yet Bugliosi found it very hard to dismiss the Odio incident. To quote from page 1309 of his book, Bugliosi says, "There is, as trial lawyers say, that unmistakable ring of truth to Odio's testimony." And he goes on, "No one examining the evidence in the Odio matter can feel too sanguine about the conclusion he reaches, yet I feel that the slight preponderance of evidence suggests that Oswald was in fact the American among the three men who visited Odio." Bugliosi knew the evidence in the Kennedy case back to front, and he always rigorously went wherever the evidence led him. So when he says that it seems more probable to him than not that Sylvia Odio was visited by the real Oswald, I think he's worth listening to. Another anti-conspiratorial writer who believes that Oswald did in fact visit Sylvia Odio is Jean Davison in her book Oswald's Game. Like Vincent Bugliosi, Davison points out that if Oswald did turn up at Odio's apartment with two unidentified Cuban men, that doesn't automatically mean that he and those men were involved in any kind of conspiracy to murder Kennedy, or that we need to start imagining that Oswald might really have been a closet anti-Castro right-winger. In fact, the Odio incident fits in perfectly well with our known picture of Oswald as a scheming left-wing loner. Oswald had long had a habit of spying on his right-wing enemies so that he could pass on their secrets to his communist heroes. This habit went all the way back to when he tried to defect to the Soviet Union in 1959 and offered to tell the Soviets the fairly useless military secrets that he'd picked up while serving in the Marines. If you assume that Oswald was playing a similar kind of game at Sylvia Odio's place, the incident makes perfect sense. In fact, the Oswald described by Sylvia Odio sounds so much like the real Oswald in his scheming infiltration mode that I think this becomes one of the key reasons why we have to believe that the incident happened. It's like if somebody tells you that they've run into a friend of yours at a party, even though you know your friend hates going to parties. Your first reaction is that this person must be wrong. The guy they saw at the party can't possibly have been your real friend. There must have been somebody else. But then this person starts describing the things your friend said and did at the party, and these things sound so uncannily like things that your friend has said and done in the past that in the end you have no choice but to believe that your friend really was at that party, no matter how unlikely it seems. There's one particular episode from Oswald's past that chimes so well with the Odio incident that it strikes me as being the smoking gun. The incident I'm talking about happened in a New Orleans clothing store in August 1963, around 6 weeks before the Odio incident. I discussed this earlier incident back in episode 4 of the podcast, but here's a quick recap of it. In August 1963, Oswald's Cuba obsession was really starting to peak. As Marina put it later, his basic desire was to get to Cuba by any means, and all the rest of it was window dressing for that purpose. When Marina says window dressing, what she essentially means is paperwork. As Oswald prepared for his big trip to Mexico City, he was putting together a nice fat file of letters and documents and newspaper clippings that he planned to present to the staff at the Cuban embassy as proof of his radical credentials. Oswald knew that communist bureaucrats love paperwork. He'd learned this lesson the hard way a few years earlier when he tried to defect to the Soviet Union. The Soviet officials in Moscow had asked to see papers that proved his worth as a potential Soviet citizen, and he'd had nothing to show them. The Soviets would have kicked Oswald out of the country inside of a week if Oswald hadn't staged a fake suicide bid that got him admitted to a Moscow hospital. So this time round, when he went to the Cuban embassy in Mexico, Oswald was determined that he wouldn't be caught short. One of the things that he planned to tell the Cubans when he went to the embassy was that he'd been keeping tabs on the activities of Castro's enemies in the United States. As part of this effort, Oswald had made a brazen attempt to infiltrate an organisation called the Cuban Student Directorate. The New Orleans branch of this group operated out of a clothing store run by a guy named Carlos Bringuier.
I had the opportunity to meet Lee Harvey Oswald on 4 different times in New Orleans. The first time was when he tried to infiltrate the Cuban Student Directorate.
That's Carlos Bringuier speaking after the Kennedy assassination. On August the 5th, 1963, Oswald had walked into Bringuier's clothing store. Bringuier was behind the counter, talking to a couple of local high school kids who were interested in joining the struggle against Castro. Oswald barged into their conversation in a typically unsubtle way. He asked them if this was, quote, the Cuban exile headquarters. He then started trying to convince Bringuier and the 2 students that he was a passionate anti-Castro man himself. He told them that he'd served in the Marines and that he could make himself useful to Bringuier and his comrades by training them in the art of guerrilla warfare. He said that he was ready to go to Cuba and join the fight against Castro personally. He talked about specific methods that he would use to blow up bridges and derail trains. He talked about how easy it is to make homemade gunpowder. Oswald came off as so gung-ho that Carlos Bringuier smelt a rat. He thought that Oswald might be some kind of pro-Castro agent. So Bringuier told Oswald that he and his organisation had nothing to do with military activities, and he refused to accept a cash donation from Oswald when he tried to offer him one. The next day, Oswald came back to the store when Bringuier wasn't there, and this time he dropped off his personal copy of the Marine Guidebook, which was full of handy tips about things like combat tactics and hand-to-hand fighting. It's hard to ignore the parallels between the Bringuier incident, which unquestionably did occur, and the Odio incident, which many people believe didn't occur. In both cases, you have Oswald presenting himself as an enemy of Castro in an effort to infiltrate an anti-Castro operation. In both cases, Oswald strikes the real Cubans as having a fairly crude view of Cuban politics, as the real Oswald really did. In both cases, he aggressively stresses his credentials as a Marine. In the Odio case, he brags about his expertise as a marksman, which was something that Oswald frequently did, according to Marina. In both the Odio case and the Bringuier case, Oswald portrays himself as extremely gung-ho, in fact, as even more gung-ho than the real anti-Castro people he's trying to fool. In both cases, he urges the real anti-Castroites to take things up a notch and become more violent, almost as if he's trying to goad them into involving themselves in some kind of violent conspiracy which he can then later spill the beans about to Castro himself. And in both cases, Oswald pushes things too far so that the real anti-Castro people become suspicious of him. Carlos Bringuier told the Warren Commission, quote, "I had some feeling that I could not trust him." Leopoldo told Sylvia Odio that he was worried that Oswald wasn't sincere and might be a bit loco. The parallels between these two incidents are pretty striking, and there's no way that Sylvia Odio could have known about the Bringuier incident when she first told her story about Oswald to the FBI, just a month after the assassination. At that time, the details of the Bringuier incident were not publicly known. So if Sylvia Odio did make up these details that matched the Bringuier incident so closely, she was lucky enough to hit several different bullseyes completely by accident. She hit another bullseye when she mentioned the little smile that Oswald had on his face when he came to her door. Oswald's self-satisfied little smile or smirk was a well-known characteristic. Bringuier mentioned it several times in his Warren Commission testimony, and when Jack Ruby recalled the thoughts that flashed through his mind in the second before he shot Oswald dead, he cited Oswald's smirk as one of the main things that made him whip out his gun and pull the trigger. Here's the thing about Sylvia Odio's story that I can't get past. When she first started telling it to people, including the FBI, her story must have struck them as making very little sense. In fact, Sylvia Odio must have found the episode deeply baffling herself. All the publicity said that Oswald was a Marxist and a devotee of Castro, and yet here was Sylvia Odio saying that Oswald had been introduced to her as a rampaging enemy of Castro. There's almost no angle from which this story makes any sense. And given that the story doesn't make sense in itself, it also doesn't make much sense to suppose that Sylvia Odio could have made it up or imagined it. If you invented or imagined a bogus story about Oswald, you would hardly say that he'd behaved in a way that completely contradicted his public image as a communist. Nor does it make any sense to believe that the man Sylvia Odio saw was an imposter, looking to set Oswald up for Kennedy's murder. Anyone who wanted to frame Oswald would have wanted to frame him as a communist assassin, not an anti-communist one. There's really only one very narrow angle from which the Odio story makes perfect sense, and that is if Sylvia Odio saw the real Oswald and he was up to his old tricks as a left-wing infiltrator of right-wing groups. But to know that Odio's story makes sense from that angle, you have to know about Oswald's secret history as an infiltrator. That information is the decryption key to Sylvia Odio's story. Only if you have that information can you see that her story is not only quite coherent, but actually very plausible. But this decryption information only became available many months after Sylvia Odio first told her story. When she told it for the first time, nobody in the world, apart from the late Lee Harvey Oswald himself, knew about his secret history as a leftist agent provocateur. I said earlier on that it's very hard to believe that Sylvia Odio would have made up a story that implicated her own side of Cuban politics in Kennedy's murder. What's even harder to believe is that she would invent or imagine a story about Oswald that made zero sense on its face, but a ton of sense if you knew about the most obscure deep cuts of Oswald's private life. Again, the idea that Sylvia Odio hit a sweet spot like this by accident seems to me to stretch the laws of probability to breaking point. To go back to the Carlos Bringuier incident, there is one important difference between it and the Odio incident. In the Bringuier incident, Oswald talked about using violence against the Castro regime. In the Odio incident, you have Oswald, or the Oswald figure, saying that somebody ought to shoot President Kennedy. When Oswald did his anti-Castro shtick in Carlos Bringuier's store, he hadn't said anything sinister about President Kennedy. In fact, he hadn't mentioned Kennedy at all. So did something happen between these two incidents that might have made Oswald start to think that shooting Kennedy would be a good idea? If you look carefully at the evidence, you find that something did happen. On September the 9th, a month after the Bringuier incident and 2 weeks before the Odio incident, Oswald's hero Fidel Castro said something very interesting to a UPI reporter in Havana. Castro told the reporter that he'd become aware of secret plans to assassinate him, which were apparently being sponsored by agencies of the US government with President Kennedy's approval. Castro told the reporter that President Kennedy was, quote, a cheap and crooked politician. And he added, quote, "We are prepared to fight them and answer in kind. United States leaders should think that if they are aiding terrorists' plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, they themselves will not be safe." That sounded a lot like a threat, and a pretty rash one at that. But in fact, Castro was making a calculated move. As the CIA said later, Castro's UPI interview was, quote, a more than ordinary attempt to get a message on the record in the United States. Castro was sending a very deliberate warning to the Kennedy administration. He was saying, I know all about the CIA's secret plans to assassinate me, and you'd better lay off because two can play at that game if you don't. Castro's inflammatory remarks were reported in all the major American newspapers, including the main morning newspaper in New Orleans. We know that Oswald was a big newspaper reader, and we also know that he was a big fan of any story about Castro. So it's a fair assumption that he read this story when it was printed, and that he knew that Castro had, in effect, made a public threat to eliminate President Kennedy. This, of course, doesn't mean that Oswald formed a firm plan at that moment to eliminate President Kennedy himself on Castro's behalf. In fact, I wouldn't suggest that he did. I don't think Oswald's plan to shoot Kennedy crystallized until a couple of months later, when he was working at the Texas School Book Depository and found out that Kennedy's limousine would be coming straight past the window. But it seems fair to say that from the moment Fidel Castro gave that interview on September the 9th, Oswald would have had it in his head, as at least a general idea, that shooting Kennedy would be a pro-Castro act. It would be an act that Fidel himself would approve of. Mind you, there is a weird little contradiction here that we need to get our heads around. I've just said that Castro's remarks would have given Oswald a pro-Castro motive for wanting to shoot Kennedy. But if we believe Sylvia Odio, then just a couple of weeks after Castro made those remarks, Oswald told a pair of anti-Castro Cubans that it would be a good idea to shoot Kennedy. That may sound like a contradiction, but the fact is that at that point in history, extremists on both sides of Cuban politics had coherent reasons for disliking Kennedy. Pro-Castro Cubans disliked him for plotting to assassinate Castro and for supporting the failed attempt to topple Castro in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. And the anti-Castro extremists disliked Kennedy for having doomed the Bay of Pigs operation to failure by withdrawing American air support at the crucial moment. This isn't to say that too many pro- or anti-Castro Cubans hated Kennedy enough to want to murder him, but as we know, Oswald had a far greater taste for homicide and violence than the average person. He owned a high-powered rifle, and he'd already used it to take a shot at the head of General Edwin Walker. In fact, that's exactly why he'd bought the rifle in the first place. So whether he was posing as an anti-Castro radical or being himself as a pro-Castro radical, it would be very on brand for Oswald to believe that the logical extension of disapproving of Kennedy's politics would be to shoot him. But it was another thing for Oswald to say that out loud. In that respect, Sylvia Odio's story is almost unique. She is almost the only credible witness we have who claims that Oswald ever said he had a good mind to shoot President Kennedy. I say that she's almost the only witness to have made this claim because there is one other credible witness who's said that Oswald, just 2 or 3 days after the Odio incident, again declared that somebody ought to shoot President Kennedy. And believe it or not, the witness who reported that Oswald had said this was none other than Fidel Castro himself. This story is a little controversial, and it centres on the 2 visits that Oswald paid to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City on Friday, September the 27th, just 2 or 3 days after his alleged visit to Sylvia Odio's apartment. As we know, Oswald was pretty confident that his trip to the Cuban embassy would be a success. He thought that the staff there would give him a transit visa immediately, without any fuss. When they told him that he would have to wait the standard 2 to 3 weeks unless he could get a Soviet visa first, Oswald was scandalized. He marched over to the Soviet embassy to see if he could get a visa from them, but he got no joy from the Soviets either. They told him that he'd have to wait 3 to 4 months for his application to be processed. Oswald then stormed back over to the Cuban embassy. During that second visit, he got very agitated and he caused a scene. That much is known for sure, but exactly what Oswald said when he threw his tantrum in the Cuban embassy has always been unclear. One version of what he said emerged in 1967 when a British journalist named Coma Clark interviewed Fidel Castro in Havana. The authenticity of this interview has been disputed, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But what Clark claimed was that Castro told him that Oswald had said something very troubling when he paid his second visit to the Cuban embassy. Something so troubling, in fact, that the embassy staff immediately reported it to Castro at the time. Here's what Castro said about Oswald's 2 visits to the Cuban embassy, according to the text of Clark's interview. Quote, "The first time I was told he wanted to work for us. He was asked to explain, but he wouldn't. He wouldn't go into details. The second time he said he wanted to free Cuba from American imperialism. Then he said something like, 'Somebody ought to shoot that President Kennedy.' Then Oswald said, and this was exactly how it was reported to me, 'Maybe I'll try to do it.'" End quote. As I've said, the authenticity of Clark's supposed interview with Fidel Castro has been disputed. Castro himself vehemently denied that the interview had ever taken place. And Coma Clark's former assistant said later that she had made the interview up herself without ever speaking to Castro. She'd based Castro's purported remarks about Oswald on information that she'd obtained from a Latin American foreign minister, whose identity she never revealed. But this is where the plot thickens quite a bit, because although it does seem fairly clear that Coma Clark's supposed interview with Fidel Castro was a fabrication, it also seems clear that the information this fabrication was based on, the information that Clark's assistant got from that Latin American foreign minister, was actually extremely accurate. We know this because Fidel Castro told almost exactly the same story about Oswald to a very reliable American spy in 1964. The spy was a man named Jack Childs. Childs was a high-ranking member of the US Communist Party, and he was also one of the FBI's most prized informants. In the 1980s, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his services to US intelligence. A few months after Kennedy's assassination, Jack Childs met with Fidel Castro in Havana. At one point in their conversation, Castro asked Childs if he believed that Oswald had really killed Kennedy. Before Childs could give him any answer, Castro started explaining his own assassination theory. He said that he didn't believe that Oswald could have acted alone, but he did know for sure that Oswald had been involved. He knew this because of something Oswald had said when he stormed out of the Cuban embassy in Mexico in September. As Castro told Jack Childs, quote, "I was told this by my people in the embassy. He acted like a real madman, and he yelled on his way out, 'I'm going to kill that bastard. I'm going to kill Kennedy.'" End quote. Jack Childs quickly told the FBI about what Castro had said to him, and J. Edgar Hoover took this report very seriously. This was in June 1964, when the Warren Commission was still conducting its investigation. Hoover immediately wrote to the Commission and reported what Castro had said about Oswald. although there seems to be some doubt about whether anyone at the commission ever read Hoover's letter. Certainly there's no mention of Castro's remarks about Oswald in the Warren report. Jack Childs was a highly valued FBI informant. The Bureau always treated his reports as 100% reliable, so there can't be much doubt that Fidel Castro did tell Jack Childs that Oswald had threatened to kill Kennedy as he stormed out of the Cuban embassy. But that, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that Castro's story was accurate, because we can't know for sure who Castro got the story from. He might have got it from somebody who was inside the room when Oswald made this remark, or he might have got it second-hand from somebody who wasn't inside the room. So when you put the Castro story together with Sylvia Odio's story, what do you get? You get Sylvia Odio claiming that on Tuesday or Wednesday night in the last week of September, Oswald visited her apartment with two Cubans, one of whom told her the next day that Oswald had talked about shooting President Kennedy. And then you have Fidel Castro saying that on the Friday afternoon of that same week, Oswald said, "I'm going to kill that bastard. I'm going to kill Kennedy." I'd say that the coincidences are really starting to pile up here, to the point where it's simply far easier to believe that Sylvia Odio did encounter the real Oswald than that she didn't. To believe that she didn't encounter the real Oswald, you have to believe in coincidence on a fairly massive scale. You have to believe that Sylvia Odio somehow imagined a story that resonates in all sorts of spooky ways with all the other evidence of how Oswald was behaving at that time. I said at the start of this episode that we need to figure out two basic things about the Odio incident. One, did it really happen, in the sense that the man on Odio's doorstep was the real Oswald? And two, if Oswald was there, what did that mean? I think we've gone a long way to answering both those questions now. The Warren Commission believed that it was almost impossible that Oswald was at Sylvia Odio's apartment, and a lot of other good commentators have agreed with it on that point. But I think we've now arrived at the opposite position. I think I've shown that it's almost impossible to believe that Oswald wasn't at Sylvia Odio's apartment, unless there's evidence that proves beyond any doubt that he couldn't physically have been there. I think we're compelled to believe that he was. And if he was there, it isn't hard to work out what the meaning of the incident was, at least from Oswald's angle. Oswald was once again trying to gather intelligence on the activities of Castro's political enemies on the eve of his planned defection to Cuba. But that doesn't tell us everything about the meaning of the Odio incident. There's still the question of the other two men and what they were up to. Why did these two men never visit Sylvia Odio again, despite their promise that they would? Why did they vanish into thin air instead? Why was it that nobody in the real anti-Castro underground had ever heard of these men? Why did they claim to be friends of Sylvia Odio's father when it turned out that her father didn't know them at all? If they weren't really his friends, then how did they know so much about him, right down to what his underground code name was? It seems that Leopoldo and Angelo weren't who they claimed to be either. It seems possible or even probable that they were in fact pro-Castro agents. If they were, did Oswald know that? Or had he accidentally penetrated a group of fake counter-revolutionaries who were secretly on the same side that he was on? On the other hand, if Oswald did know these men were really on Castro's side, and if they knew he was on Castro's side too, the possibility that the three of them conspired together to murder President Kennedy can hardly be ruled out. These are tantalizing questions, but there's no point trying to answer them until we've tackled a more basic problem, the problem of all that evidence that made the Warren Commission, along with so many other reliable commentators, conclude that Oswald just couldn't physically have been there at Sylvia Odio's apartment. that evidence is pretty formidable. It's like the Odio story itself. It's too solid to be ignored or just swept under the rug. If you want to believe that the Odio incident occurred, you have to take on this inconvenient evidence and you have to try to find a way through it. And that's what I'll be trying to do in part 2 of this episode, which is coming up next time on the Ghosts of Dallas.